Is Monte Carlo overestimating the risk of your retirement plan? Interesting, is it not? Because everyone uses Monte Carlo nowadays. We've simply gone beyond the days of, I hate to say it, but like Dave Ramsey, we average 10 to 12% a year. You can take 8% a year off. We've long time, this Bill Bengen with this 4% rule, we realized you can't just use a linear rate of return in your retirement plan. So we have Monte Carlos. Now, Monte Carlo can be based on a number of things, but essentially it's based on a average rate of return. All right, that's our mean average rate of return and a volatility around the average rate of return. That's what Monte Carlo says. So when we use like a Dave Ramsey model, it's just a linear projection. The markets give us 10 to 12% each and every year. You can't do that. That's silly. And so that's where the 4% rule came in. We say, look, this is what happened. The market did this. All right, the market did that. That's not the same as a straight line rate of return. So let's check this out. My man Derek Tharp had written this in 2007 and 2017. And here's a typical bell curve that we use in a Monte Carlo. All right, and what you'll see is you'll see 3 standard deviations around an average. All right, again, I cannot stress this enough. A Monte Carlo says what is an average expected rate of return, and we're going to use 3 standard deviations, which means we get a 99.7% probability of a range. All right, so for simplicity, in this case, we have a 5% average rate of return with a 10% standard deviation. All right, so what we simply do is we take that 5% average rate of return plus or minus by 10%. That 10% is 1 standard deviation, 1. So 5 plus or minus 10, we expect within 66% of the time, 1 standard deviation, 66% of the time, we get a return that's no higher than 15% and no lower than 5 with these numbers that we're using, a 5% average rate of return and a 10% standard deviation. So pause this if this doesn't make sense. This is very, very important when you're running your own Monte Carlos. Again, a 5% average rate of return, 1 standard deviation is 66% of the time. We'd expect our performance to give us between that 1 standard deviation. Now, what we want to do to be as precise as possible in financial planning is we want 3 standard deviations, which is a 99.7% probability within the stated average rate of return and standard deviation. All right, so if we have a 5% average rate of return and 3 standard deviations, we take 3 standard deviations times the standard deviation amount, 10%, and we say 5 plus or minus 30. 10 times 3 is 30. So in any given year with this number, we'd expect to be no greater than a 25% decline and no greater than a 35% rate of return on the upside. All right. Now, most people don't care about the upside in retirement. They just care about the down. But within 3 standard deviations, negative 25 and plus 35. And this is what this bell curve is showing. They're saying, hey, this is what we'd expect most. Our average rate of return is 5. We'd expect basically 40% of the time to get 5% a year. But sometimes we'll get this right here, 15 on the plus. Sometimes we'll get this negative 5 on the down. And very rarely, but sometimes we'd expect 35 on the plus or negative 25 on the down. All right, that's how that works. Now, the interesting thing is you'll see these are called thin tails. The longer you get away from the mean, the less likely it is to happen. And yet we have tons of evidence that we have actually fat tails. Nicholas Taleb talks about that in his books Black Swan, Skin in the Game, and you should get them. They're great reads. My man Benoit Mendelbrot talks about this misbehavior of markets, a fractal view of financial turbulence, and I just got tons of notes in here, just notes on top of notes you can see, because it's very important to know that we have the Monte Carlo, or this right here bell curve. We actually have fat tails, which means that we have more probability of, I hate to say it, but bad things happening than what is shown in this graph. Now, what does that mean for you? Okay, so that means this right here doesn't reflect the reality of the downsides that are actually here beyond the 3 standard deviations. In fact, I think Benoit Mandelbrot talks about, let me see if I can't find a quote. On page 96, he says, large changes of more than 5 standard deviations from the average happen 2,000 times more often than expected. All right, under the bell curve, Gaussian rules, you'd have encountered such drama only once every 7,000 years. In fact, the data showed it happened once every 3 to 4 years. And here's his example of fat tails. All right, so here's a typical bell curve right there. And here we got the fat tails way out here. And the fat tails way out there. And again, this isn't to bash Monte Carlo. It's just this is the nature of the market. There's more risk inherent. And so a lot of people say, well, that shows you Monte Carlo is suspect. There's some legitimacy to that. The real reason Monte Carlo is suspect, though, isn't because of that. It's because each year is independent of the previous year. And we just know in history that's just not true. When markets are very dependent on the previous year for future returns. So it's just a fact. Markets don't forget what happened a year ago. All right. So my man Derek came up with this thing right here, which is very interesting. He said Monte Carlo actually has higher fat tails than what the historical rates were. So right here, Monte Carlo versus historical scenarios terminal wealth. And here we're using a 4.08%, the 4% rule of a 60-40 portfolio over 30 years. And what we're showing is that we never ran out of money if we took 4.08% as our starting point and average and increase that each year with inflation. We never ran out of money, ever. And you can see our net ending wealth after 30 years, the worst case scenario was $1. Now, if we did the same, our highest net ending wealth was $5.75 million. All right. So again, if we use historical rates of return, 4.08%, never ran out of money. We didn't leave much, but we never ran out. And the highest we left was 5.7 million. Not too shabby. But if we use a Monte Carlo, we actually ran out of money in year 15 as the worst case scenario. Not year 30, year 15. And the highest amount we left was 26 million. In fact, you can see in the 10th percentile, we had half what they had in the historical numbers. In the 50th percentile, we had significantly more than what they had in the historical numbers. And then the 90th and 100th percentile, we had huge amounts more than historical numbers. So the volatility, the variance of the Monte Carlo was significantly higher than that of the historical rates of return. You can see, never ran out of money in year 15. Died with 5.7 million is the best, died with 26 million is the best. That's a significantly higher variable than what the historical rates were, which shows you that your Monte Carlo is actually taking on more risk. Do Monte Carlo analysis actually overstate tail risk and retirement projections? And the answer is yes. Unequivocally, they do. Without question. Without question, right here. And so I emailed, I'm a friend with Derek on Facebook, and I've interviewed him a couple times. He's got a good YouTube channel you should follow. I said, everyone's favorite finance professor, Derek Tharp, wrote this a few years back about the significant risk on relying too heavily on Monte Carlo analysis. And I said, anything to add, Derek, given it's been 7 years? He goes, thanks for sharing. Not much to add other than our subsequent testing has reinforced this. Traditional Monte Carlo simulation tends to be the most unrealistic at the extremes, the fat tails. Real-world markets tend to see both momentum, short-term, and mean reversion, long-term, that deviate from the typical Monte Carlo assumption that returns are not correlated over time. This can be particularly problematic for the folks who try to plan for a greater than 95% probability of success. And he quotes this new thing he had written back in 2013, right here. How different Monte Carlo models perform in the real world, assessing quality of predictiveness and retirement income forecasting models. All right, and so basically what is a great thing here, and we go down here, he's going to show you that right here. Comparing performance predictiveness of 4 Monte Carlo retirement income forecasting. And basically what we'll have here is, though all models had significant errors, historical regime-based Monte Carlo analysis significantly outperformed traditional Monte Carlo and reduced CMA Monte Carlo, which is what I use. For context, a perfect model would have a Breyer score of 0. I don't know what that means, but I'm just using it. The worst is 1. A model and so what you'll see here is the worst is 1. So the closer you get to 1, the worse the performance prediction is. And you can see the historical is 0.13. The regime base was 0.12. The regime base I actually kind of don't like that much. It allows you to adjust on the fly, and I'm not a big fan of that. traditional Monte Carlo, and this is what I use: reduced capital at models. Capital markets assumption is the worst. Not significant. I mean, I guess you could say it's 50% worse than regime-based Monte Carlo, and it's 40% worse than historical. I don't like using historical. I don't like using regime-based. But that's what I use because I actually expect the markets to give us lower than what the historical base is, and traditional Monte Carlo is kind of based on historical numbers. So this is what I use right here. So it's less reliable, but it's less reliable on the downside of what I'm saying. So there's more downside risk in my own Monte Carlo projections than the right capital that I use, which I like. I'd much rather err on the side of caution than err on the side of optimism. And as such, if you want to be overly optimistic, I'm not your guy. I want to say no. When I run financial plans with people, I'm trying to poke holes, dude. And most of my clients, it's hard to poke holes in it because they're freaking righteous, dude. They're just crushing. If you haven't hired me, you're not righteous, obviously, and you're not crushing. If you hired me to be your financial planner, you're righteous and crushing. But anyway, this isn't a sales pitch, but you should. I mean, my goodness, you're like, I got to retire next year. Well, let's get started, man. Yeah, I mean, I got no smoke to blow up your butt. But your Monte Carlo does overemphasize the downside risk in your retirement plan. It's just a fact. And as much as people want to use Monte Carlo to kind of debase it, and my man Jim Otar, I forgot his name. I love Jim, a great guy. I think he's retired now, but he had a bunch of stuff on the lack of Monte, kind of bashing. I say bashing, but talk about Monte Carlo in negative light somewhat. And dude, I completely agree. But again, the reason I agree isn't because it's overly optimistic. It's not. It's just not. It's not overly optimistic. It's overly pessimistic. I like that. But the reason I don't like the Monte Carlo is because, again, it shows, like Derek says, that things are independent of each other and returns are not. There's just momentum and trends. Without question, there are. How do you reduce that risk? You really can't because you don't know what the future is going to be. You have no clue. So you got to start someplace. And I'd always rather err on the side. Look, I'm from Maine, dude. I'm from Maine. All right. I was lived on an island off the coast of Portland, Maine. You can't get much more prepper mindset than that. It can't because you just don't know if the boats are going to show up. You see what I'm saying? It gets cold in Maine. That goes crazy. And as such, you're always got to be a prepper if you're going to live in these environments. So for me, I always expect the worst and pray for the best because that's how you should live in your prepper mindset. And if you get better than worse, then you're like, hey, man, things are pretty good. But hard to get worse and worse, if that makes sense. Anyway, hope it might not make sense, but paw the like button. If you don't paw the like button, that means you don't love Pablo, and subscribe. Well, God bless. We'll see you. Merry Christmas. How dare I?